Good morning and welcome to Leasehold Knowledge Weekday 2. This morning's session is hosted by James Paul, Director of EK Reinstatement Cost Assessment, and he will be covering a run through of many of the misconceptions and jargon surrounding RCAs. I'd like to just say a quick thank you to our sponsors, our headline sponsor, FR Consultants, and event sponsors, Foresight Consulting, BBIS Heating, Beehive Block Management, Fixflow, Future Group, JM2 Group, MRI Software, PropRec, Present It, Realty Law, Tetra Consulting, and TNA Building Services. If you have any questions throughout the session, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and James will try to get through as many as possible at the end. We are also recording today's session, and it will be available to watch back later today via our YouTube channel. I will now pass you over to James to begin this morning.
Thank you, Vicky. Welcome along, everyone, and good morning to you. Apologies for the slightly delayed start. We had a few IT glitches just as we got going over here. But here we have our presentation on RCAs, the FAQs, starting from the very basics. So hopefully, at the end of this, you'll have something of an idea of what RCAs are, what the major pitfalls and myths are, why you need them, when they're important, and essentially what they're all about. So if you wouldn't mind clicking to the next slide, please, Vicky. I think this will then show us the agenda. So probably talking about 40 minutes of me talking this morning, and then maybe about 20 minutes or so of questions, if necessary, breaks and so on. I'll try and keep it fairly light. We've got about 20 to 25 commonly asked FAQs that are generally submitted to us from property managers, and a little bit of a talk on our VAT white paper and a brief overview of our services with a little bit of questioning at the end. So here we go. If we want to move on to the first FAQ, if you would just like to click on. Brilliant, thanks. Oh, first of all, we've got a little disclaimer. This is quite good. So in any topic that is a little bit contentious, you have professional statements, which are essentially facts that no one would argue with. Recommended good practice, just a little bit lower down on that scale there, which essentially are still fact-based, but maybe certain professionals would have different interpretations of them to others. Professional opinions, which can differ between different professionals, but are normally based on the conclusions drawn from recommended good practice. And finally, personal opinions right down at the bottom. And we try and stay clear of expressing any of them on subjects like this, because it's not very helpful for people to be told, I don't really believe this because I think X, Y, or Z, and so on. So generally speaking, everything that you hear today will be the top two of those categories. And when we do deviate into professional opinion, if you just want to click the mouse, Vicky, you'll see where the answer is at the end of the FAQ. Instead of saying answer, it'll say James's answer. So that's your cue to know that it's my professional opinion rather than recommended good practice or professional statements. But moving on, hopefully all of you will be able to see this lovely picture of a Sikh temple here. And the reason why I've stuck this on as the first proper slide is basically just to get you all to think a little bit out of the box. I know many of you probably manage blocks of flats, typical you know, apartments and so on. But every building under the sun out there, pretty much without exception, is insured for something. And the figure that is used for the insurance is derived from a reinstatement cost assessment. And sometimes you get some very unusual buildings like this one here, which is obviously made to look a little bit like a form of architecture that would have been popular in India in the 1600s, but it was actually built this century and is only about 20 years old. And the superstructure is comprised out of really quite modern materials, reinforced concrete, blockwork, brickwork, things that hopefully you'll all be very familiar with. But the facades are made out of natural stone and carved in very ornate fashions to emulate that historic form of architecture. And to make things even more sort of complex, on the face of it, you might look at that and think, oh gosh, it's a 4 or 5 story building, look at the height of it. But because it's got a rather large sort of inner room where all the praying and so on goes on, much of it is actually single story. So in talking about floor plates and building heights and levels and so on, this one would be a little bit of a complex one to value. And the reason why we've stuck this on as our first proper slide is basically just to underline the point that all buildings are individual. There is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all rate. It's not as simple as just measuring the area of the footprint of something and then multiplying it by a number. It requires an insightful analysis, a proper inspection, ideally internally and out, to really establish an accurate insurance value. And what we're going to show you, hopefully, over the next half hour or so, is why this is important. So if you wouldn't mind clicking on to the next one, please, Vicky. We'll start off with, what does reinstatement cost actually mean? And if we click that slide again, we should get the definition come up. And the answer is, reinstatement cost, or the reinstatement value, is what it would cost hypothetically to rebuild a given building from scratch to modern day building regulations, that keeping the visible exterior and standard of fit out in the interior more or less the same. So obviously there, you've got a building that's maybe 18 or 19 years old. If that burnt down tomorrow, someone would be expected to reinstate it, keeping the general look of the exterior the same, and probably the interior as well, if we're honest, probably wouldn't change that much. But even in the last 20 years, building regulations moved on a little bit. You'd probably find you need a little bit more roof insulation, slightly more up-to-date electrics, little differences like this. All of these things should be captured in a reinstatement cost. They shouldn't be surprises that come out of the woodwork when the insurer comes to rebuild the building. This is what your surveyor attempts to do with every asset they come to a figure on. And so all of this, if you like, slightly hidden and discreet building regulation upgrade stuff is buried in those figures. And this is sometimes why buildings that perhaps didn't cost very much to build a few years back cost a lot more to reinstate now, because you have to start putting in things like fire detection, smoke detection, emergency lighting, and so on, up-to-date fire doors in all the major escape routes. These things may not have been mandatory in the 1960s and so on. So that is what we mean by reinstatement cost. And clicking along to the next slide, hopefully we'll come up with our next FAQ. Are there any other acronyms for RCA? And this is something that causes a lot of interest. There are so many acronyms out there. I've just put probably the sort of top 5 most regularly seen ones just to the right there in those bubbles. And if we click the slide again, you'll see what some of these things stand for. So you've got building reinstatement valuation, building reinstatement cost assessment, insurance valuation, insurance rebuild cost assessment, and even fire insurance valuation. And all of these things essentially mean the same thing. And the reason why we've stuck with calling them RCAs is because about 10 years ago, the RICS, the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, came up with a guidance document that decided to call these things RCAs, and it's sort of become the industry standard term for them. But don't get too confused if you see people talking about BRCAs or IVs or something like that. They essentially mean the same thing. You're looking at an assessment that gives you a reinstatement cost for your building or asset, and ultimately what you're looking for is that number at the end of the report, which is your declared value, which you can then give to your insurance broker, who'll then go out and seek the best possible insurance terms for you. So hopefully that explains that one. Moving on to the next slide. How often should an RCA be done? Still generates a little bit of confusion, this one, but the answer is basically every 3 years. So what the RICS say in their latest guidance document for RCAs, which came out in 2018, is that a major review should take place every 3 years. And what does a major review mean? Well, most people interpret it to mean an RCA, because an RCA with a full physical inspection is about as big a review as you could do for a built asset. In the intervening years, the first, second year anniversary of your RCA, you can get away with an index link or even a desktop update or evaluation. We actually do these things for free for you if you've previously ordered a full RCA with an inspection from us in the past. And I think plenty of other surveying practices offer similar services. It's becoming quite commonplace now. So don't be afraid to ask your old surveyor for an updated value 12 months and 24 months after you order a fully paid for RCA. So that's that one, once every 3 years. A few people do still mention, isn't it supposed to be 5 years? Or I don't know where the 5-year figure came from, but I suspect it's probably a much, much older guidance document from 10 or 15 years ago that perhaps hinted that it should be every 3 to 5 years or something like that. But the official line now is a major review every 3 years. Moving on, anyway. Yeah, that's just basically a summary of the last slide. But the next question, what is the difference between the declared value, the sum and the sum insured? And again, this sometimes causes some confusion. So when you get an insurance schedule from your insurance broker after having taken out cover, you'll probably get a sheet of paper that looks like this as a PDF in your emails. And there's lots of different numbers on it, but the one that really probably is most important, if we just click that slide, hopefully we'll get a little red ring around, maybe click it again. There we go. That is the building declared value. Now, this is the figure that your surveyor comes up with in their RCA report. And you may have noticed just to the left of this, if we perhaps click the slide again, you have a slightly higher figure, the 18 million figure. And the reason why that is significantly higher than the building declared value is because that sum insured includes what's called an inflation provision. Now, an inflation provision we'll come on to later, but it's essentially an allowance for inflation during the rebuild period of the building. Now, when you're rebuilding a building, it's a relatively simple and straightforward one, you might get it done in a year and a half, 2 years or something like that. But for sort of 6 or 7 story one with a few lifts and underground car park and so on, it's not uncommon for the rebuild period to maybe be 3 years. And during that time, obviously, an awful lot of inflation can take place. Just look at the last 3 years. Gosh, what a lot of inflation's happened then. I'm sure I don't need to explain to you. So inflation provisions are important. And in this case, there is, I think, a 30% uplift, as sort of said in the answer section there. And this creates your sum insured or insured sum. And again, we have more acronyms here, SI or IS. If you ever see those in the insurance documentation, they're probably talking about sum insured or the insured sum. Again, interchangeable terms, perfectly okay to use either one. I'd probably go for sum insured. It's slightly more commonplace than insured sum. Of course, DV nearly always means declared value on anything to do with insurance. I'm not aware of there being other acronyms that use those 2 letters. So hopefully that demystifies some of the terminology that you get on insurance schedules. If we could perhaps click the slide once more, it's perhaps just worth looking at the premium here. £16,000 to insure that building that had a declared value of 14.4 million and was then insured for 18. And as you can see, that works out as approximately £180 per £100,000 worth of insurance. Now, this policy came from a couple of years ago. You might see at the top there, 1st of April 2020. Insurance has probably gone up a little bit since then. However, this particular building was in the centre of London and in quite a sort of busy part of the world. If you're insuring stuff out in the suburbs, £180 for every £100,000 of insurance probably is almost current for today. London, central London, high risk areas, especially if you're getting into the realms of terrorism covered, you could be looking at £200 for every £100,000 worth of cover now, and scarily rates are really going up. But as an asset manager or a property manager, all you really need to think of for your clients in terms of insurance schedules are these three numbers: the building declared value, the sum insured, and obviously the premium, what your client is paying. And those are the three main things. More on insurance schedules later in the presentation. I think if we click the slide again, it should move on to the next topic. Here we go. Yeah. Again, another photograph here. Hopefully you can all see that. Is the declared value related in any way to the market value of the building? So what we have here on this slide is actually an old Victorian bank. Nice little building. It's a sort of Gothic revival thing. Lots of turrets and chimneys and interesting sort of windows and so on. Now the facade's actually made of a mixture of carved stone and also terracotta tiling, and it's very, very ornate. There's sort of all kinds of little details there. To recreate something like this today would actually cost really quite a lot of money. It's an enigma for us, because this particular bank had obviously closed. The bank decided they didn't need that branch anymore. And it was in a part of town that was, perhaps a little bit rough around the edges, subject maybe to a bit of gentrification. Of course, everything still has a market value. Many people would consider this an up-and-coming part of their local area. But we had a situation here where the declared value for the building was much, much, much more than the actual market value. And I think if we click the slide again, you should see some text come up on that, giving us a little bit of a story. So, for instance, on this one, we had a situation where you almost are in a situation of negative equity with respect to your insurance declared value and your market sale price. And this does sometimes happen. We frequently find that in converted mill or warehouse buildings in the north, you can sometimes find that the reinstatement costs are more than the total sum of all the flats put together. And this contrasts quite starkly with central London, where obviously you've got very, very high market sale prices, and you can have blocks of flats that are perhaps made in quite simplistic ways from concrete, think sort of archetypal 1960s tower block. But because they're in a certain postcode, the market value of the flats inside is absolutely extortionate, and you can have a situation where you've maybe got a tower block that's insured for £10 million, but its market sale value of all the flats put together could be 40 million. The complete inverse of what we had here with that high street bank that was maybe only worth 1 million, that probably had an insurance declared value of about 4 million. So lots of things to think about there. Regional variations are very, very key. Not only does the cost of building fluctuate throughout the country within the regions, but the market value of buildings fluctuates wildly as well. So short answer is no, the declared value is not really related in any way at all to the market value of the building. You can't somehow derive what the insurance value should be from the sales cost of the building. I know that in years gone by, we had sort of estate agents and people that would maybe, just apply a simple, quarter percentage or something to a market value in order to try and get an insurance figure. And I know some insurance brokers tried to do similar things, but it's a very ham-fisted approach and liable to lead to quite devastating levels of underinsurance or sometimes even overinsurance. And you're much better off getting a proper RCA in order to inform yourself of the insurance declared value. There really isn't an easy way of finding it out otherwise. So that's that question. Moving on anyway to the next slide. If you were doing a reinstatement cost assessment for a large estate that includes lots of buildings separately insured, how do you divide your declared value figures accordingly? Well, this is a very common problem. As you can see on the right-hand side here, we've got a little estate, 4 or 5 blocks there, all sort of outlined in pretty colours, and a sort of underground car park as well that presumably runs under the full expanse of everything, and some communal gardens built on a sort of podium above it in between blocks. Quite a complex site, lots of moving parts here. But who should pay what for the insurance? Well, the simple answer is, and I think if we click the slide again, it should come up, is get your surveyor to do it for you. Whenever you order an RCA from ourselves, for instance, we will work with you to establish breakdown figures for each individual block. And we can do this on any basis you want. Internal floor area is normally the metric most people want to see. Sometimes they prefer it to be done under unit numbers. Often the leases are silent on this, but look to your lease if you want to know the definitive on this matter. Obviously, commercial premises sometimes differ from residential. Sometimes it's the freeholder who is tasked with invoicing the commercial tenant separately. But look to your lease if you want the definitive answer on how a breakdown should be apportioned. But if it's silent, it's probably your prerogative as the property asset manager to divide it up in the way you see fit. But don't be afraid to ask us to assist you. It is all part of the service with many companies like our own, and we're here to help. And this is part of the RCA the way we see it. So don't stay silent. Anyway, moving on to the next topic. Do your RCAs include all plant and equipment in a building, such as a communal boiler system or a lift? Well, as buildings get larger and more complicated, questions like this become really quite pertinent. If we click the slide again, hopefully we'll get a bit of text up on the screen with the answer. But the simple, I suppose, way of thinking about it is, if it's a fixed item, it's part of the building, and generally movable furniture, things like sofas and so on, would be considered to be contents. So this means things like light switches, chandeliers, light fittings, anything that's essentially screwed into the wall or the floor and wouldn't fall out if you could physically turn the building upside down, would be considered to be part of the building rather than the contents. But in mixed-use buildings where you've got commercial tenants fixtures, such as large extract fans, and you can see on that photo on the right, there's quite a lot of air handling equipment and stuff to do with the cafes and restaurants that are along the ground floor. Quite often in commercial leases, it will state that the commercial tenants fixtures beyond that of the Cat A shell and core are considered to be commercial tenants furnishings and fit out, and therefore not part of the freeholder's responsibility to insure. And this is where it starts getting quite complex from a building and insurance perspective, because if you're the property manager for that building, and if you're tasked with providing insurance, not only for all the residential occupiers, but also for the commercial tenants as well, at least insofar as the Cat A parts, how do you abstract all that catering equipment, the pizza ovens, the extract fans, and all the other things that are presumably fixed to the building and therefore part of the building rather than part of the contents, from your insurance figure? And again, the simple answer here is ask your surveyor to do it for you, because that's what we're here for. So if you're insuring a mixed-use building, don't be afraid to go out to your RCA provider and say, right at the offset, look, we need a figure here, but what it needs to include for is everything that's part of the building when it comes to the residential parts. But when it comes to the commercial parts, we need you to do something clever for us. We need you to give us just the figure for the Cat A base fit out. And we want you to assume that all the tenants fit outs, the kitchen equipment, any kind of tables and chairs that are bolted to the floor, all the commercial tenants, furnishings and so on. We want you to delete all of that and imagine it's not even there, because that's their responsibility, not ours. We don't want our residents and other people contributing for insurance of that if it's already being separately insured by the commercial occupier themselves. And that's what we're here to do. And we can provide these sorts of RCAs where essentially the commercial figures are Cat A, shell and core only, but the residential parts are fully insured. And you can save quite a lot of money on this setup. And for this particular client, we actually managed to lower their insurance declared value from about 120 million before we arrived on site to about 101 million by the time we left, because there was almost 20 million pounds worth of air handling equipment, pizza ovens, commercial kitchens, and restaurant fit out that we were able to deduct and say, do you know what, you don't need to worry about this, someone else is insuring it in the first place. So that was a situation there where we more than earned our fee and actually managed to provide a bit of good news to the freeholder and the stakeholders that were fronting the insurance for the main building there by providing them with a nice little discount. So a happier story there for everyone, I think. Moving on to the next slide, next question. Aside from the bricks and mortar cost of a rebuilding or reinstatement, what else goes into your calculations? Well, if we click the slide again, we'll get a little summary here. But essentially, other than the bricks and mortar element, you've also got the costs of demolition. So if a big fire or flood or something happens, it guts a building, you still need to pay for that site to be cleared somehow. So the bulldozers and the demolition teams that clear all of that stuff and remediate the area so that you've got essentially a clean site again, that forms part of the declared value figure. Then you have professional fees. So that could include architects, surveyors, structural engineers, maybe landscape architects if you've got some communal gardens. If you're dealing with a listed or historic building, you might have to start bringing in some specialists to those ends, historic built environment specialists and so on. There's lots of different professionals that can go into the professional side of managing a reinstatement, and they're all bundled up in what you'll see on an RCA as professional fees. And these vary from building to building. Obviously, a relatively simple system built block of flats might have a lower professional fees figure than a grade 2 listed historic building in the centre of London. No need to explain why, I'm sure you can understand. The more complex a reinstatement is, the more different professionals and so on you might need. Then we have other costs as well. Statutory authority fees. So again, normally these are things, planning costs, section 106 agreements, fees paid to the local authority planning department. And then last of all, you have VAT and other costs that could be relevant when rebuilding or reinstating a building. So for instance, VAT is normally chargeable on professional fees in pretty much every case. It's not always chargeable for rebuilding costs under certain circumstances. Residential buildings, for instance, that have suffered a full or near total loss, if they are purely residential, can sometimes be subject to VAT reductions, VAT exclusivity, but in practice, it's very hard to obtain the VAT back. And what we recommend, and what lots of other people are starting to recommend, is including VAT from works with residential buildings as the default setting. It just essentially places your client in a fully protected position, whereby if they suffer a devastating loss of greater than 80% of the value of the building, but somehow, due to circumstances, it doesn't trigger the VAT break from the government, they're still not underinsured, and the declared value will more than adequately meet the costs of reinstatement. More on that little topic later. It is a bit of a complex one, but essentially what we recommend, and this is why you've got the James's answer here, is that you include VAT on residential rebuilding costs, and in commercial settings you need to include it anyway, and that's just the way it is. So hopefully that explains that one. If we move on to the next slide here, we've got a rather helpful little summary table. You've probably seen something quite similar to this on many of the RCAs you've dealt with. When you receive an RCA report from your surveyor, obviously check that all those numbers add up to the one at the bottom. Sometimes if they do not, it's because somebody's possibly made a little mistake or a transcription error. It's worth double checking that the demolition costs and the professional fees as well are able to, be traced back to the rebuilding cost, the top figure where it's labelled A. And if we click the slide again, I think we'll get a red box come up that essentially shows all of those little bits there, which are essentially non-bricks and mortar items. So demolition, professional fees, public authority fees, and VAT, all of that white collar stuff that doesn't actually involve bricks and mortar, a substantial component of the reinstatement value. And on the penultimate line there, you might notice as well, rebuilding period in months, 27. So essentially just over 2 years, 2.25 years to rebuild that particular building. Quite a long time, perhaps, when you consider planning times, lead-in times to get demolition contractors to clear a site, and all the other things that go together towards a reinstatement. You can probably see how 27 months could have elapsed from the time of a devastating fire or flood or accident to the point at which point you have a fully reinstated new building with the keys ready for new occupiers to take occupation in. And that is the summary of a reinstatement cost table there. Click the slide again. I think we'll move on to the next one. How should I deal with a surveyor who is unwilling to show their calculation methodology? Well, in a situation where you have a contentious valuation, perhaps the declared value has risen dramatically, gone up 30% in 3 years or something like that. It's natural for stakeholders and clients and so on to really understand, really want to understand what is going on the detailed level. If we click the slide again, I think we'll get a little bit of an answer here, and it's quite simple. We say if a surveyor is a bit reticent in wanting to show you their calculation, challenge them, yes, because no surveyor worth their salt should be afraid of showing you their methodology or rates or calculation build-up. It's often unhelpful to share this publicly with every stakeholder. Obviously, that can lead to subjective analysis, but for a layperson with a reasonable understanding of insurance, it shouldn't really be an issue. And we maintain this idea that if you can't understand our reports or make sense of them, we've done something wrong. And if you feel like you're being blinded with science by someone, or if you're simply not being shown the methodology, challenge them, because these reports, these assessments are not rocket science. They're not meant to confuse people. There should be a rationale behind every valuation. It shouldn't just be a figure picked out of the air without any basis. And if you can't get a surveyor to show you their calculation methodology, it's worth pursuing it and taking it further, because it's essentially something that you should be able to say. It's not a secret. It shouldn't be held to be as such. It's there for you. That's the service that you've paid for. Moving on to the next question anyway. How would you go about valuing the insurance value of a building with timber balconies and cladding at the moment? Obviously, Grenfell still quite fresh in everyone's minds. If you click the slide again, we'll have an answer here. Basically the same way that you would do with any other building cost. We essentially replacing the contemporary inert material that was proven to be fire resistant and compliant and appropriate for the situation involved. Obviously those balconies there, you can see they've got timber cladding on them. A little bit of concern over those at the moment, not without good cause. If that building was being reinstated, we'd probably expect to see a brickwork panel there or something that's far more inert to the spread of fire, and would probably give everyone a little bit more peace of mind. Moving on to the next question. If I order an RCA and the new value is wildly different from the old value from 3 years ago, and both surveyors say they're right, who is really right? Well, I think we touched on this a little while ago. Just sort of a note for the present. Obviously, there has been quite a lot of inflation recently, especially in the last 12 months. That doesn't always explain everything. It depends from building to building how much inflation you should be expecting. However, on a very, very broad macro scale, 8% in the last year, I would say, is probably a minimum you would expect to see in increases from on a broad brush perspective. But certain buildings may have gone up as much as 20%. It really does depend on their complexity, the components that they're made out of, and the shortages and ability to get trades such as those to site. There is no simple rule of thumb answer on this. Inflation has just risen, but again, it comes back to being able to see that calculation methodology from your chosen surveyor. If they're reticent or unwilling to explain why they think there has been a rise, it is worth investigating it with them. Moving on to the next slide. Oh, here we go. This is the summary answer from that one. But essentially, yeah, that's okay. We can move on. All of these slides will be sent out to people at the end if they wish to have them. And I believe News on the Block will be putting this recording on their website as well if anyone wants to go over any of these answers. Can RCAs be done without visiting the property in question? Well, if we click the slide here, hopefully we'll see a building here, that's got a rather large overhang on the rear aspect. One of the problems with ordering desktop RCAs, if the surveyor doesn't actually physically attend site, is little aspects such as this could be missed. And I'm sure you can imagine quite easily how from the air, a building like that could be misconstrued as having a continuous ground floor under the footprint of the jettied section. And this sort of error is one that's quite easily repeated on a number of similar buildings. If we click that slide again, we'll have a look at another building that's got a vehicle portal or a vehicle tunnel running underneath it. And again, from the air, that could quite easily look like a continuous linear block of flats. And there's another airspace there that is essentially not part of the building that it could get included, and you would potentially end up with an overvalued site as a result. If we click the next slide, I think, we've got another building there with a similar setup. But just to the left-hand side of the vehicle portal there, you might notice those black doors are actually garages. So not only is there a vehicle tunnel under the wing of the block that's straight ahead, but the whole of the ground floor on the left-hand side wing is garages rather than habitable accommodation, like living rooms, bedrooms, and kitchens, and so on. And again, this would affect the build rate as well. So on a desktop assessment, something like this that's not visible from Google Earth or Google Street View could get valued all as residential internal parts, when actually pretty much the whole of the ground floor on that aspect is something different that should in a perfect world have a lower rate. So these are the sorts of issues you can get with ordering desktop valuations. Essentially what we're saying here is they are cheaper to procure from surveyors, but you can quite often end up with an insurance declared value that's a couple of million more than it would have been if you'd ordered a full physical inspection. And so a false economy develops whereby you save on the surveyor's fees but lose on your insurance premium. So generally, as a rule, I would say probably steer clear from desktop valuations where you can. Obviously no harm in using them as an interim assessment tool between two major review physical on-site RCA inspections, but they can be problematic with sites that do not have great access from the air or from Google Street View. Mistakes can happen. Next slide, if we move on. Can RCAs be done without visiting the property in question? Well, if we click the slide again, we've got the summary answer there. Hopefully those photos just before then illustrate that quite well. And the next slide here, if a leaseholder in a block of flats undertakes a substantial multi-million-pound refurbishment project, including designer kitchens and so on, should I organise an RCA after they have completed the works, and if so, who should pay? Well, nice long-winded answer here, but if we click onto the next section of the slide, essentially we are saying they should pay. The leaseholder who procured the works should pay in an ideal situation for a revaluation. If we click the slide again, we'll get some pictures, I hope, of a very nice apartment here. As you can see, really, really great walk-in wardrobe there. And click again. This is not my flat, I promise. Lovely bathroom, very, very bespoke finishes. Click again. Absolutely incredible kitchen space there. This actually used to be a former auction house, and it got converted into one singular apartment with a very, very high-end bespoke kitchen and some real exquisite use of marble and so on. Click the slide again. I think we'll see an alternate angle. Fantastic space, 4 metre, even 5 metre high ceiling there. And I'm sure you can imagine the rebuild value for that apartment is going to be considerably higher than many of the other flats in that building. And this one apartment will have a strong bearing on the insurance declared value for the site. If we click that slide again, I think we'll get the summary answer again. If we just click again, please, Vicky. Essentially, what we're saying is when substantial refurbishments take place, it does affect the declared value. It will affect the declared value for the whole block. And so you will probably want, as part of the license to alter, for the resident to carry out those works, to couple that with a new RCA on conclusion of the works, so that an accurate declared value is produced for the block, and so that the insurance sum is right on the money. It's often pertinent to get the leaseholders carrying out the works to pay for the new RCA. It will be a relatively trivial cost in comparison to a serious fit-out program like that, but it just helps keep the peace with the other leaseholders. And if there's nothing in the lease defining who should pay for an RCA in that situation, if the lease is silent, it's often helpful to couple it to the subject leaseholder who's actually carrying out those works. And this would apply just to a simple domestic extension as much as it would do to a full-scale refurbishment like that. If we click the slide again, I think we'll move on to the next section. Very quick sales pitch of using ourselves. Obviously, you've got clear communication and tried and tested procedures. Hopefully, we've given you a little bit of a flavour here of some of the common myths in the world of RCAs and some of the frequently asked questions. But I think if we click the slide again, we should head on to the questions part of this, and we're finishing off just with about 10 minutes to go. I hope you managed to follow that. If anyone does have any questions, please feel free to stick them in the chat, or feel free to ask them out loud now, and we will attempt to answer them for you. Vicky, have we got anything in the Q&A coming up?
No, I'm just having a look. There's no Q&As coming at the moment, so I think you've pretty much answered a lot of questions. 1 second, I've just got someone raising their hand. I'm just going to let her talk for a moment to ask the question. Hi Anna, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks James. It was really a very useful session. In residential buildings where you have a mixture of residential and commercials, you did refer to the fact that you look at the lease terms to see who pays for the insurance of the commercial part of the building when you carry out your valuation. If the lease doesn't have a specific provision to differentiate between commercial and residentials, but it just simply says that a landlord has to take out an insurance for the entire building, what do you do? Because we have cases where leaseholders have to fork out for the entire insurance as based on the valuation of an entire building rather than separation between the value of commercial and residential. What's your experience? How do you tackle that?
My experience is if the lease is silent, if it basically doesn't say how the commercial premises should be insured and they just say that the landlord should do it, it's really the prerogative of the property manager to agree a system that everyone is happy with, and execute it in that fashion. So that could be done on a square meter basis if people decide that's the fairest way of doing it. Often you need measured surveys or at least confirmation of everyone's apartment size and the commercial premises size before you can do that, but that's not too difficult to arrange. Or if people want to keep it simple, it can be done on a simple unit basis. So if you've got 12 flats and 2 commercial units, that's 14 units in total. You could just divide everything by 14. But obviously that is going to favour someone with a very large apartment or someone with very large commercial premises, and it's going to penalise someone that's maybe only got 1-bed flats. So ordinarily, I would probably say area seems to be the fairer way of doing it. But if the lease is silent, ultimately it's up to the property manager and the freeholder to come up with a system that everyone can live with, and that would essentially be how it would be divided in practice.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Anna. Okay, I think that's the only questions that we've got at the moment, James. So I think everything else has probably already been covered within the session.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for listening, everyone. If you do suddenly think of a question or you haven't had time to ask today, please feel free to email Vicky or I. Send it along, and we'll get back to you privately with the answer if we can answer it. And in the meanwhile, enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for having us. Thanks for listening to me. And I'll pass you back to Vicky.
Yeah, absolutely. I will be sending out a copy of James's slides and the recording later today, so everyone will be able to watch it back and go through all of the slides. We also have our session this afternoon on licence for alterations with Amber Krishnambird from Osborne's Law. So if anyone would like to join us for that, please feel free to register via the link which was sent to you by email. Other than that, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, James, for your time today, and I hope to see you all tomorrow at the live conference.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.